I walked into that board meeting like a shadow, the executive assistant nobody bothered to notice. Until I opened the red-sealed envelope and read one sentence aloud, and the entire room went ice cold. 6 directors, the CEO, and the chief counsel could only stare at me, mouths agape, because I was the child they never thought would surface. And I wasn't there to claim a father, I was there to take back everything. My name is Madeline Ross, and for the past 18 months, I've been the executive assistant that Charles Dalton never really sees. 34 years old, armed with an MBA from Northwestern that I earned nights and weekends. I occupy the glass-walled office just outside his corner suite at Northbridge Capital. The financial district knows this building, 43 floors of steel and ambition rising from Chicago's Loop, where billions change hands with the stroke of a pen. They call me efficient, discreet, the woman who anticipates Dalton's needs before he voices them, who can draft merger documents at midnight and have his espresso ready at 6 a.m. sharp. What they don't know is that I've been studying him like a lab specimen for over a year, cataloging his habits, his weaknesses, the way his jaw tightens when he's cornered. Dalton built Northbridge from nothing, or so the Forbes profiles claim. The financial press loves him, the titan who never blinks. Chicago's most ruthless deal-maker. At 62, he's carved out an empire worth $3 billion, specializing in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. He's the kind of man who can destroy a company before lunch and sleep soundly that night. I've watched him operate from my position in the shadows. The way he dissects quarterly reports, hunting for blood in the water. How he can smile at a handshake while already planning his counterpart's destruction. He speaks in clipped sentences, wastes no words, and trusts no one completely. Except perhaps his executive assistant, who he assumes has no ambitions beyond scheduling his meetings and filtering his calls. But I didn't come to Northbridge to be anyone's assistant. I came here with a file folder hidden in my apartment, filled with photographs, documents, and recordings my mother left behind. Evidence of a connection to Charles Dalton that runs deeper than any employment contract. The other employees whisper about me sometimes, how I never join them for drinks, never share personal details, never seem to have a life outside these walls. They're right. I don't. Every evening, I return to my Lincoln Park apartment and spread those documents across my dining table, studying them like a detective working a cold case. Bank records, legal papers, correspondence dating back 35 years. I've become an expert at reading the subtle tells in Dalton's behavior. The way his left eye twitches when the board questions his decisions, how he drums his fingers against his thigh when Victor Lane, the board chairman, challenges his authority. The slight pause before he answers questions about his past, as if he's carefully selecting which version of the truth to reveal. From my desk, I can see into his office through the glass partition. I watch him during his private phone calls, noting how his voice drops to a whisper for certain conversations. I've memorized his schedule, his patterns, the rhythm of his days. I know he takes his blood pressure medication at 11 a.m., that he orders the same lunch from the same restaurant every Tuesday, that he keeps a locked drawer in his desk, that he opens only when he thinks no one is watching. What Charles Dalton doesn't realize is that his anonymous executive assistant, the woman who's invisible enough to overhear everything but important enough to access everything, holds the key to his destruction. I've been building my case file meeting by meeting, document by document, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment is coming soon. The board is restless. The quarterly numbers are shaky. And Dalton's grip on power is finally showing cracks. When the time comes, I'll be ready to step out of the shadows and reveal exactly who I am and why I am here. The photograph arrived in my mother's effects 2 years ago, tucked inside a manila envelope marked, "For Madeline, when you're ready." I wasn't ready then. I'm not sure I'm ready now, but ready or not. Here I am. It's a Polaroid, edges yellowed with age, dated July 1989. My mother, Elena Ross, stands beside a man I now see every day. Charles Dalton, 30 years younger, still hungry, still climbing. His arm rests casually around her waist outside what looks like a law firm's office building. She's radiant, wearing a summer dress that shows the slight curve of her belly. I was already growing inside her, though neither of them knew it yet. On the back, in my mother's careful handwriting, before he chose power over love. The rest of the envelope contained what I can only describe as a dossier of abandonment. Hospital records from my birth, showing father unknown on the birth certificate. Legal documents dated 3 months before I was born. Papers that made my stomach turn when I finally understood their contents. A non-disclosure agreement, a financial settlement, a formal waiver of all parental rights and inheritance claims, signed by Elena Ross. But it was the audio recordings that broke me. My mother's voice, weak and raspy from the cancer treatments, speaking into her phone during those final weeks. He came to the hospital when I was 7 months pregnant, not to check on me or to see if I needed anything. He came with papers. His lawyer, some shark in a $1,000 suit, explained that Charles had career considerations to think about, that a paternity scandal could ruin his prospects at the firm. I've listened to these recordings dozens of times, each word etched into my memory like acid on glass. He offered me money, Madeline, enough to disappear quietly, to raise you somewhere far from Chicago, to never contact him again. I was 23, pregnant, and terrified. I thought I loved him. I thought he loved me. But Charles made it clear that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. The recordings reveal a systematic erasure, how he convinced her that signing the papers was best for everyone, how he promised to take care of things if she ever needed help, a promise he never kept, how he made her believe that she was protecting me by agreeing to his terms. I signed everything. Baby. Every document, every waiver, every promise to stay silent. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was giving you a chance at a normal life, away from his world. But the most devastating revelation came in her final recording, made just days before she died. I kept copies of everything, every document, every payment record, every piece of correspondence, hidden in a safety deposit box all these years, because I realized, too late, that Charles built his empire on lies. That settlement money he paid me, it came from funds that legally belonged to both of us. Partnership assets from the small firm where we first met. I signed away rights to money that was partially mine to begin with. The legal papers confirm it. In 1989, Charles Dalton was still a junior partner at Morrison & Associates, where my mother worked as a paralegal. They had a brief relationship, and when the firm dissolved, certain assets were distributed among the partners and senior staff. My mother's share was folded into Charles's settlement payment to her, making her signature on those waiver documents legally questionable. I was a fool, Madeline, but you don't have to be. You have every right to reclaim what should have been yours. What should have been ours. The box also contained financial records showing how Charles used that initial capital to launch his own practice, which eventually became Northbridge Capital. Blood money, my mother called it, the foundation of his empire built on her silence and my erasure. The photograph stares back at me from my kitchen table every morning. Two people who look happy, who look like they have a future together. Before ambition consumed one of them completely. Before a pregnancy became an inconvenience to be handled with NDAs and hush money. I've memorized every detail of that younger Charles Dalton. The genuine smile, the relaxed posture, the way he looks at my mother like she matters. That man is gone. Replaced by the calculating predator who sits 30 feet away from me every day, completely unaware that his biggest mistake just became his most dangerous enemy. The first cracks in Charles Dalton's armor appeared during a supposedly routine board meeting 3 months ago. I was taking minutes, invisible, as always, when Victor Lane dropped his bombshell with surgical precision. The Meridian acquisition numbers don't add up, Charles. Lane is everything Dalton pretends to be. Old money. Harvard pedigree. The kind of man who can destroy you with a raised eyebrow. As board chairman, he's been circling Dalton like a shark sensing blood for the better part of a year. I've watched their chess match unfold through careful observation and strategic eavesdropping. The due diligence was thorough, Dalton replied, but I caught the telltale finger drumming against his thigh. He was rattled. Was it? Because our forensic accountant found some interesting discrepancies in the offshore holdings. Cayman Islands structures that seemed designed to obscure rather than optimize. The temperature in the boardroom dropped 10 degrees. I kept typing, documenting every word while my mind raced. Lane wasn't fishing, he had something concrete. From my position by the window, I could see the battle lines forming. Lane commanded the loyalty of 3 other board members: Patricia Morrison, the steel magnolia from Houston who'd never forgotten how Dalton had muscled her out of a defense contract; David Kim, the tech millionaire who'd publicly questioned Dalton's old-school methods; and Robert Sterling, whose family had built Chicago's skyline and who viewed Dalton as an opportunistic upstart. That left Dalton with 2 reliable allies: Margaret Walsh, who owed her board seat to his recommendation, and Thomas Bradley, whose construction firm had won numerous Northbridge-backed contracts. A deadlocked board, with the CEO holding the tiebreaker vote, except in matters of his own removal. I began staying late, using my access to compile intelligence on both sides. The beauty of being an executive assistant is that you become furniture. People speak freely around you, assuming you're too busy or too unimportant to matter. I learned that Lane's group had been building their case for months, hiring private investigators to trace Dalton's financial dealings back to his early partnership days. But Dalton wasn't defenseless. Through careful listening, I discovered he'd been gathering dirt on Lane's group. Morrison's family foundation had some questionable tax arrangements. Kim's company had used aggressive accounting practices that skirted SEC regulations. Sterling's construction business had employed undocumented workers on several projects. It was mutually assured destruction, corporate style. Both sides possessed enough ammunition to wound the other. But neither had the decisive kill shot. They were trapped in a stalemate, each side afraid to pull the trigger first. Then I realized something that made my blood run cold and my pulse quicken with opportunity. I was the only person in the building who understood both sides' strategies. Lane's group saw me as Dalton's loyal assistant, useful for information, but ultimately harmless. Dalton treated me as an extension of his own will, never considering that I might have independent thoughts or motivations. I began feeding each side carefully selected intelligence about the other. Nothing that could be traced back to me, nothing that would tip the balance too far in either direction. I wanted them focused on each other, bleeding each other dry, while I positioned myself for the moment when I could deliver the decisive blow. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dalton had built his career on leveraging other people's conflicts, standing aside while adversaries destroyed each other, then swooping in to claim the spoils. Now I was using his own playbook against him. During board meetings, I watched the subtle warfare unfold. Lane's knowing smiles when Dalton stumbled over questions about subsidiary structures. Dalton's cold stares when Morrison pressed him on executive compensation. The way Kim took notes during every exchange, building his case one revelation at a time. They were all so focused on each other that none of them noticed the real threat sitting quietly in the corner, documenting their every move, learning their weaknesses, preparing for the moment when I would reveal that their entire conflict was about to become irrelevant. Because while they fought over control of Charles Dalton's empire, I was preparing to prove that a significant portion of that empire had been built on stolen ground, and that the rightful heir to those assets was already in the room. Karen Blake came highly recommended through channels I couldn't reveal to her. A corporate attorney who specialized in inheritance disputes and had a reputation for dismantling seemingly airtight NDAs. When I walked into her Michigan Avenue office 6 months ago, I brought my mother's entire archive in a leather briefcase that had belonged to my grandmother. "This is unusual," Karen said after reviewing the documents for the 3rd time. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel underestimate her. "The original settlement appears to incorporate assets that your mother had legitimate claim to. We spent weeks dissecting every page, every clause, every seemingly innocent paragraph. The beauty of my mother's documentation was its thoroughness. She'd kept everything, including correspondence that showed Charles's lawyers had deliberately obscured the true nature of the settlement funds. Your mother wasn't just signing away parental rights, Karen explained during one of our evening sessions. She was unknowingly transferring her stake in partnership assets that legally belonged to her. The Morrison and Associates dissolution created a pool of funds that should have been distributed equally among qualified personnel. The Morrison and Associates angle was our golden thread. Charles had convinced my mother that the settlement money was his generous personal contribution, when in fact it included her rightful share of the firm's dissolution proceeds. She'd signed away money that was already hers. But the real breakthrough came when Karen's investigator traced Charles's early investments. The seed capital for his first independent practice, the foundation that eventually became Northbridge Capital, had been funded partially with those same partnership assets. If we can prove that your mother's financial interest was fraudulently obtained, Karen said, we can argue that you have a legitimate claim to the shares that were purchased with those funds. We worked methodically, building our case like archaeologists reconstructing a civilization from fragments. Bank records showing the transfer of Morrison and Associates dissolution funds, corporate filings from Charles's early practice, stock purchase agreements that traced directly back to the settlement money. The paper trail was damning. Charles hadn't just paid my mother to disappear. He'd used her own money to do it, then built his empire on that foundation of fraud. Karen's team discovered that Charles currently held his Northbridge shares through a complex web of offshore structures, but the core ownership could be traced back to those original investments. By our calculations, approximately 15% of his current holdings had been purchased with funds that should have remained my mother's. The statute of limitations on fraud is longer than on simple contract disputes, Karen explained. And since your mother was essentially defrauded into signing away assets she didn't know she owned, we have grounds to void that portion of the settlement. But knowing we had a case was only half the battle. We needed to weaponize it at exactly the right moment. When Charles was most vulnerable and least able to mount an effective defense, I provided Karen with intelligence about the board's internal warfare, the precarious balance of power, the specific pressure points where Charles was most exposed. She crafted our legal strategy like a military campaign, designed to maximize shock value and minimize his response time. We're not just going to file a quiet lawsuit, she said. We're going to confront him directly, in front of the board, with irrefutable evidence that he's been operating under false pretenses for 35 years. The final piece of our puzzle was timing. Through my position, I knew that the board was planning an emergency meeting to address the growing concerns about Charles's financial irregularities. Lane's group had finally gathered enough evidence to force a vote of no confidence. That's our moment, Karen said. When he's already under fire, when his allies are wavering, when he's focused on defending against the board's attack, we'll hit him from an angle he never saw coming. We prepared documentation packages for every board member, complete with genetic testing results, financial forensics, and legal precedents. Everything sealed in red envelopes marked confidential, board eyes only. The night before the confrontation, I sat in my apartment reviewing our strategy one final time. 35 years of lies were about to unravel in a single meeting. Charles Dalton, the man who'd built his career on calculating every angle, was about to discover that his greatest vulnerability had been sitting 30 feet away from him for 18 months. Tomorrow, the invisible executive assistant would step out of the shadows and reveal herself as the rightful heir to the empire he'd stolen from her mother. The emergency board meeting was called for 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, ostensibly to discuss operational restructuring and leadership evaluation. I arrived 30 minutes early, as always, arranging the conference room with the mechanical precision that had made me invisible for 18 months. Water glasses filled to exactly 3/4. Notepads positioned at precise angles. The red-sealed envelopes hidden in my briefcase under the credenza. Charles entered at exactly 2:58, his usual power play of arriving just before the meeting started. He looked confident, almost predatory, wearing the charcoal Armani suit that he considered his armor. He'd spent the morning on calls with his legal team, preparing for Lane's anticipated attack. "Good afternoon, everyone," Victor Lane began, his voice carrying the weight of old money and older grudges. "We're here to address some concerning financial irregularities that have come to our attention." The battle lines were drawn exactly as I'd observed them for months. Lane, Morrison, Kim, and Sterling on one side of the polished mahogany table. Walsh and Bradley flanking Charles like loyal soldiers. The corporate attorney, James Harrison, sat at the far end, ready to referee the bloodbath. "These allegations are baseless," Charles interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Victor, your witch hunt has gone on long enough." I sat in my usual spot by the window, tablet ready, officially invisible while internally counting heartbeats. Lane's group began their presentation methodically. Forensic accounting reports, offshore structure diagrams, suspicious transaction patterns. Charles deflected each attack with practiced ease, his responses calibrated to reveal nothing while admitting nothing. For 45 minutes, they circled each other like prize fighters, landing, glancing blows, but nothing decisive. Morrison questioned the Cayman Islands holdings. Charles cited tax optimization strategies. Kim pressed about consultant payments. Charles referenced competitive necessity. It was exactly the stalemate I'd predicted. Both sides had ammunition, but neither had the kill shot. That's when I stood up. The room fell silent. In 18 months of board meetings, I'd never spoken unless directly addressed. I was the human tape recorder, the living furniture, the woman who existed only to document their words and fetch their coffee. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "But there's something the board needs to know." Charles's head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. "Madeline, this isn't the time for—" "Actually, it's exactly the time." I walked to the credenza with deliberate steps, retrieving the red envelopes. "I have documentation that's directly relevant to this discussion." I placed an envelope in front of each board member, saving Charles's for last. The red wax seals caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "What is this?" Lane asked, though his tone suggested he sensed opportunity. "Evidence of financial fraud dating back 35 years, I replied. "And proof that Charles Dalton has been operating this company under false pretenses since its inception." The room was dead silent. 7 of the most powerful people in Chicago stared at me like I'd just announced the building was on fire. I opened my own copy of the documentation, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "My name is Madeline Ross. I've been your executive assistant for 18 months, but I'm also the daughter of Eleanor Ross, who worked as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates in 1989. Charles's face went white. For the first time in our acquaintance, I saw him completely blindsided. "And I'm here to inform this board that I am the legal heir to approximately 15% of Charles Dalton's Northbridge Capital Holdings, shares that were purchased with funds fraudulently obtained from my mother 35 years ago." I looked directly at Charles, watching decades of carefully constructed lies crumble in real time. "I'm also here to inform you that Charles Dalton is my biological father, and that he has been in violation of his fiduciary duties to this company since the day he founded it." The silence stretched like a taut wire. 6 board members sat frozen, envelopes unopened, trying to process what they'd just heard. Charles stared at me with the expression of a man watching his empire collapse in slow motion. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Open the envelope," I said quietly. "The DNA results are on page 12. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause in conversation, but the suffocating stillness that comes when the entire world shifts on its axis. 7 people sat frozen around the mahogany table, red envelopes in front of them like unexploded bombs. Charles's face had gone from white to gray, the color of old concrete. His hands, usually so steady when signing million-dollar deals, trembled as he reached for his envelope. For 35 years, he'd believed this moment would never come, that the past was buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. "This is—" he started, then stopped. his voice catching in his throat. Charles Dalton, the man who never showed weakness, who'd built his reputation on iron self-control, was visibly unraveling. Victor Lane broke the spell first, tearing open his envelope with the precision of a surgeon. The rustle of papers seemed deafening in the tomb-like silence. His eyes scanned the documents rapidly, decades of legal training allowing him to process complex information at lightning speed. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then looked up at me with something approaching awe. "You're serious." "Deadly serious," I replied, my voice carrying across the room like a death knell. One by one, the other board members opened their envelopes. Patricia Morrison's perfectly composed expression cracked as she absorbed the genetic testing results. David Kim's tablet remained forgotten as he stared at the financial forensics. Robert Sterling's face grew darker with each page, his family's old money sensibilities offended by the scope of the deception. Charles finally managed to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "You can't prove. This doesn't mean." "Page 12, I said calmly. "DNA confirmation. 99.7% probability of paternity. I had the test done 3 months ago using hair samples from your hairbrush." The admission hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, Charles Dalton looked old, defeated. "Page 15, I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Bank records showing the transfer of Morrison & Associates dissolution funds into the settlement account. Page 18, corporate filings proving that those same funds were used to purchase your initial Northbridge shares." James Harrison, the corporate attorney, was frantically taking notes, his legal mind already calculating the implications. "If this documentation is authentic," he said carefully, "then we're looking at potential fraud charges, SEC violations, and a complete restructuring of corporate ownership." Charles tried to rally, falling back on the aggressive tactics that had served him for decades. "This is blackmail, industrial espionage. You people hired her to—" "Nobody hired me." I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to draw blood. "I applied for this position specifically to get close to you, to learn your routines, your weaknesses, your secrets. I've been planning this confrontation for 2 years." The words hung in the air like a confession and a threat rolled into one. Margaret Walsh, Charles's most loyal ally, was staring at me with undisguised horror. Thomas Bradley kept shaking his head, as if he could somehow make this nightmare disappear. 2 years? Lane asked, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "Since my mother died," I replied. "Since she finally told me the truth about who my father was and how he'd stolen from her to build his empire." Charles made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Even if this is true, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud," I finished. "My attorney has already filed preliminary injunctions. Your assets are about to be frozen pending a full investigation." The room erupted in chaos. Harrison was on his phone with the company's legal team. Morrison was demanding to know why the board hadn't been informed about potential liability issues. Kim was calculating the stock price implications. Sterling was muttering about family reputation and disgrace. Through it all, Charles sat in stunned silence, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. The invisible assistant who'd brought him coffee every morning. The efficient note-taker who'd documented his every move. The daughter he'd tried to erase from existence. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice hollow. "All of it." "Every second of it," I confirmed. "From the moment I walked into your office 18 months ago." The great Charles Dalton, the man who prided himself on seeing every angle, had been outmaneuvered by the ghost of his own past, and the game was just beginning. The chaos lasted exactly 47 seconds. I know because I was counting. Watching the room fracture along predictable lines while Charles sat in stunned silence, his empire crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Victor Lane was the first to recognize the shifted landscape. His political instincts, honed through decades of boardroom warfare, immediately grasped what my revelation meant for the balance of power. "I call for an emergency recess," he announced, his voice cutting through the confusion. "We need to discuss the implications of this development." "No," I said firmly. "We finish this now." All eyes turned to me. For 18 months, I'd been the woman who deferred to their authority, who spoke only when spoken to. Now I was giving orders to some of the most powerful people in Chicago. "According to the documentation in your envelopes," I continued, "I am the legal owner of approximately 15% of Charles Dalton's Northbridge holdings. That makes me a significant shareholder in this company." James Harrison was frantically consulting his legal databases on his tablet. "She's right," he said reluctantly. "If the ownership claims are valid, she has voting rights equivalent to her shareholding." Charles finally found his voice. "This is extortion. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted. "And I am—" I turned to address the entire board. "I'm exercising my voting rights to support the motion of no confidence in Charles Dalton as CEO." The room went silent again. Lane's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. Morrison leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Kim was already calculating the new power dynamics. "We need to verify these claims." Margaret Walsh protested weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. Even Charles's most loyal ally could see the writing on the wall. "The verification is in the envelope," I replied. "Forensic accounting, legal precedents, and genetic confirmation. Everything you need to understand that Charles Dalton has been operating under fraudulent pretenses for 35 years. Lane seized the moment. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence." "Seconded," Morrison said instantly. "This is highly irregular." Harrison protested. "We should postpone pending legal review." "The board has a fiduciary duty to act on material information," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent months studying corporate law. "And fraud allegations certainly qualify as material." Thomas Bradley, Charles's remaining ally, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Charles, is this true? About her mother?" For the first time since I'd known him, Charles Dalton looked truly broken. The mask of invincibility had cracked, revealing the scared young lawyer who'd once stood beside my mother in that faded photograph. "Elena," he whispered, as if speaking her name was a confession. "Yes," I said quietly. "Eleanor Ross. The woman you convinced to sign away her rights to assets that were partially hers to begin with. The woman who raised your daughter alone while you built an empire on stolen ground." The vote was swift and brutal. Lane, Morrison, Kim, and Sterling voted for removal. I cast my 15% in favor of the motion. Walsh and Bradley abstained, unwilling to defend the indefensible. Charles didn't vote at all. "Motion carries," Lane announced with barely contained satisfaction. "Charles Dalton is hereby removed as CEO of Northbridge Capital, effective immediately." Charles stood slowly, his movements mechanical. For a moment, I thought he might collapse. Instead, he looked directly at me, his eyes filled with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, but a kind of hollow recognition. "You're her daughter," he said simply. "I can see it now. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. The way you never back down." "I'm nothing like her," I replied coldly. "She was kind. She was trusting. She believed in the goodness of people, even people who didn't deserve it." I stood and walked to where he was gathering his papers with shaking hands. The entire board watched as I delivered the final blow. "She forgave you, you know. Even after everything you did to her, she still hoped you might have some humanity left." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not that forgiving." Charles stopped moving. When he looked up at me, his face was a mask of devastation. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." Charles Dalton walked out of that boardroom a broken man. No security escort, no dramatic confrontation. Just the hollow footsteps of someone whose entire world had collapsed in the span of an hour. The great manipulator had been outmaneuvered by the daughter he'd tried to erase from existence. The board immediately offered me the interim CEO position. Victor Lane, ever the politician, saw an opportunity to install a puppet he could control. You've certainly proven your capabilities, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I declined without hesitation. I didn't come here to run his company, I said, gathering my papers with the same methodical precision I'd used to arrange their downfall. I came here to end his reign. The confusion on their faces was almost comical. They'd expected me to seize power, to claim the throne I'd fought so hard to reach. Instead, I was walking away from everything they valued most. Then what do you want? Patricia Morrison asked, her voice tinged with genuine curiosity. Justice, I replied simply. And I got it. Within a week, the financial press was calling it the Northbridge coup. Charles's removal dominated headlines for months. The SEC investigation that followed uncovered decades of questionable practices, offshore structures designed to hide assets, and the systematic exploitation of legal loopholes that had made him rich while others suffered. But the most damaging revelation was the simplest one. Charles Dalton, the man who'd built his reputation on ruthless honesty, had been living a lie for 35 years. The foundation of his empire was fraudulent. His entire persona was built on stolen ground. I used my 15% shareholding to vote myself onto the board, then promptly divested the holdings and donated the proceeds to organizations supporting single mothers and children of absent parents. Every dollar that had been stolen from my mother went to help women who'd faced similar abandonment. Charles tried to fight the legal challenges, but his heart wasn't in it. The investigations revealed more than just the original fraud. They exposed a pattern of corporate misconduct that stretched back decades. His legal team abandoned him when it became clear he couldn't pay their fees. His social circle evaporated when the scandal made him radioactive. I saw him one last time, 6 months after the board meeting. He was leaving a coffee shop near his empty office. The company had revoked his building access, looking like a man who'd aged 20 years in half a year. Our eyes met through the window, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been regret. He didn't approach me, didn't try to speak, just nodded once. A gesture that contained more honesty than any words he'd ever spoken to me. I didn't nod back. 3 months later, I learned he'd moved to a small town in Oregon where he was working as a paralegal at a 2-person law firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd destroyed my mother's legal career had ended up exactly where she'd started. I returned to my apartment that night and packed away the photographs, the documents, the recordings that had consumed my life for 2 years. My mother's voice, preserved in those final recordings, had guided me through the darkest moments of my quest for justice. You don't have to carry this anger forever, baby, she'd said in her final message. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. She was right. Charles Dalton had stolen 35 years from both of us. I refused to let him steal another day. I never returned to Northbridge Capital. I never took another corporate job. Instead, I used the settlement money to start my own practice, helping other women navigate the legal system when powerful men tried to silence them. The game was over. I had won. And for the first time in my adult life, I was finally free. Thank you for listening to this story of justice, revenge, and the power of truth. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts about Madeline's journey. Did she go too far, or was her revenge justified? Please subscribe to the channel and share your own experiences with fighting for what's right. Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them.